So Keir Starmer and the Labour government have just announced a range of new policies that they hope are going to regain control of the immigration system in Britain. But the reality is that this white paper is not going to fix our immigration crisis. If you want to really know what's going on, I'm just going to explain to you in this video how we got to this point and why I think the current status quo is just completely dismal and failing for you, the British taxpayer. Because the reality is, for the last 30 years, under governments on both the left and the right, under both Labour and the Tories, the state has presided over an extreme policy of mass uncontrolled immigration, a policy that is really only supported by 10 to 15% of Britain, but is firmly opposed by the vast majority of hardworking, tax-paying, law-abiding British people. And what happened really is that this system was already out of control before the vote for Brexit. We saw net migration spiral to 300,000 every year before people voted for Brexit. And that vote, remember, was not just a desire to leave the European Union, but was a desire to lower migration and regain control of the borders or take back control. But what happened after the Brexit referendum was absolutely outrageous because Boris Johnson and the Tories betrayed all of those people that voted to leave the European Union by presiding over the wholesale liberalization of immigration into Britain. By that, I mean they made it much easier to migrate into Britain. They didn't deliver the high-skilled migration policy that Boris Johnson promised. There were no engineers and scientists from Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, much more culturally compatible countries. What we got instead was masses of low-skill, low-wage migration from outside of Europe. Nearly 90% of all migration into Britain today comes from outside of Europe, from culturally different, if not culturally incompatible nations elsewhere in the world. And so ridiculous was this policy, so shocking was this policy, that even though Conservatives were talking about having high-skilled migration, only about 15% of people coming in on high-skilled worker visas. The rest were relatives, dependents, international students, refugees, asylum seekers, illegal migrants. And so what Britain saw was not just a scale of demographic and cultural change that is unprecedented in its history, but since 2021 and until today, Britain has also been flooded with lots of people who have basically made our economy weaker, have reduced living standards, and have made the housing crisis worse. Now, what's interesting about the Labour white paper is that even Labour now acknowledge those things are true. I've been writing about them for much of the last 5 years. I was one of the first to actually say, if you look at the research on this kind of migration and how it's changing economies elsewhere in Europe, esteemed academics like Dr. Jan van der Beek in the Netherlands have shown this. The exact kind of migration we now have, low skill, low wage, non-European, is much more likely to be a net fiscal cost than a net fiscal gain. And so if you just applied that research to the UK, it was obvious years ago this wasn't going to work, but nobody listened. I think I was one of only a handful of people pointing this out, and we were doing it over at my Substack at mattgoodwin.org. And so what's interesting about the Labour white paper today is that finally an actual government in the UK, even though it's not doing anything in terms of policy, has acknowledged that yes, mass migration is not driving economic growth. GDP per capita is going backwards, productivity is flat, and migration is making the housing crisis worse. Lots of experts now concede this point, that we're not building enough homes. Meanwhile, mass migration is jacking up house prices and jacking up rents. Again, I was saying this for years. Now, finally, people are beginning to recognize it and try and at least have an open conversation about it. It's not only housing, it's not only the economy. Freedom of information requests show that mass migration is also driving up crime. We know that foreign nationals are more than twice as likely as the Brits to be arrested and to be convicted of various crimes. And we know they're 3.5 times more likely to be arrested and convicted for sexual offenses. And we know that specific national groups like Afghans and Eritreans are 20 times more likely to be arrested and convicted of things like rape and sexual assault. So mass migration is undermining our economy, it's undermining our society, it's undermining our culture. That's why I've campaigned against it. That's why I've tried to change the national conversation in this country. But now look at what Labour are doing in terms of policy. Yes, they're acknowledging some of the arguments, and okay, that's good. But look at what they're actually doing in terms of policy. They're not setting an annual net migration cap. So there is no definitive number that they are focusing on that they are trying to achieve. They're not actually clamping down in a major way on low skill, low wage migration. They're tinkering around the edges in the social care system, but they're not fundamentally overhauling this system. They're not leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. They're talking about reforming Article 8 in the ECHR, but they're not actually taking us out of the ECHR, which is what we would need in order to be able to deport foreign criminals and people arriving on the small boats much more easily. They've said nothing about the housing and the accommodation sector, like the fact that the British state is using your money to outbid you in the private housing market to make that housing available for people who have often broken our laws. It's completely outrageous. They've said nothing about the fact that over the next 10 years, you, the British taxpayer, you're going to be asked to pay somewhere around £15 billion on hotel and accommodation costs for people who are arriving in the small boats here in Dover. £15 billion, that's enough for 15 brand new hospitals. Labour have said absolutely nothing about that. They've said nothing about reforming the welfare state to provide an active deterrent to people who are crossing over. And they've said nothing about the fact that the number of small boat crossings is now up nearly 50% on 2024, up nearly 80% on 2023. Keir Starmer basically is gaslighting you on this issue. Labour do not have a plan for migration because, as we all know, they're committed basically to maintaining the status quo. So don't be fooled by the Labour government. Don't be duped into thinking what they're offering is real change, because they're not. My view now, my default view, is that the only way you can send a message to Westminster, the only way you can get this system to be responsive to you, the only way you can actually deliver an outcome that the vast majority of British people want to see, is by sending them a message at these elections, local elections, elections in Wales, by-elections, the next general election, by supporting an insurgent party that is ultimately going to be the corrective this system needs. Immigration and the failure of our leaders to deal with immigration is why Nigel Farage and the Reform Party just won the local elections. Immigration and people's unresolved concerns about it is why Reform just won the Runcorn and Helsby by-election. It's why Reform are now going to win the elections in Wales next year and storm through lots of those Labour heartlands in the northeast of England, the Red Wall and Wales. Because people have had enough. They've had enough of being lied to for 20, 30 years. They've had enough of watching the country they love become unrecognisable. And they've had enough of having to live with the financial costs of a policy, an extreme policy that is being imposed on them, the costs of which the elite class don't have to pay. It's not their kids that are going to have to compete with migrants and their children in the state school system. It's not them who are going to have to compete in the NHS. It's not them who are going to have to live with the criminality and the higher rates of crime in low-income neighbourhoods. It's not them who are going to have to pay the cost of this policy, it's you. That's why I'm out here talking to local politicians about these issues. That's why I'm making these videos. That's why we're building an alternative ecosystem. We can reach 500,000 people every day now on YouTube, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Substack. I want you to be part of that community. I want you to help us share it, to get this information and evidence out there. Thank you for listening. Hit like and subscribe. Hit the bell if you're on YouTube. Come and join us at the Substack. That makes our work possible. mattgoodwin.org. See you soon. Thank you for watching.
The Labour Party's been a bit scared of making the positive case for immigration for quite a number of years. I think we need to turn that round. The whole of the United Kingdom is better because of immigration.